down in the hole. He's got the fire and the fury at his command. Well, you don't have to worry if you hold on to Jesus' hand. We'll all be saved from Satan when the thunder rolls.
Hold Jesus' hand. Hold Jesus' hand. That's all we can do in North Carolina right now is pray. Pray that the Art Pope Pat McCrory reign is short and sweet. They are doing so many things that if you just add them all up and present them to the voters of North Carolina, the reasonable middle of the voters, the reasonable middle will see that Art Pope and Pat McCrory are way far to the right of where most people in North Carolina want to be, and we will vote them out fairly soon. That's why they're trying to institute all these institutional ways, Carol, of solidifying their power, because they know that people aren't going to stand for what they're doing. That's my hopeful me. That's the hopeful Todd, Carol. Welcome to Monkey Time. Thank you, Sue, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are joined today by Sue Sturgis, who is the editorial director of the Institute for Southern Studies.
Yes, yes.
You are responsible for most of the environmental reporting and a significant chunk of the reporting in general.
Yes.
At the Institute's Facing South blog, is that correct?
Yes, yes. We're a nonprofit research and journalism organization based in Durham, North Carolina. We've been around since 1970. The organization was founded by pioneers of the civil rights movement, and so a lot of our work is focused on justice issues, including environmental justice.
But you're not just in North Carolina. You cover everywhere from Mississippi and the Gulf and New Orleans all the way, Florida, all across the South.
The entire South, yeah. And I actually started back right in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, watchdogging the reconstruction of Louisiana and the Gulf Coast region. So, yeah.
You have a lot of stuff on your plate right now with this legislature in North Carolina. So we're going to be talking about fracking, about the renewable energy law, about offshore drilling and things like that with someone who actually works on these issues on a daily basis. Thank you. Again, for joining us. So there's kind of a larger theme here if you step back and look at what the legislature is doing. And there's the theme of what is the role of science here? What is the place of science in this Republican legislature? And do you have anything you want to say about that?
Well, it's a theme that as you follow like you said, there's so many things happening right now in the legislature, so many different issues related to the environment, but one of the threads that seems to connect them is whether science is going to be used as the basis for decision making or politics. So that's one of the things that we're really focused on looking at right now at Facing South.
And so this week, fracking is big, right? Boy, they're moving fast, aren't they? They really don't want to let us catch our breath. Yeah. Unemployment crushed, unemployment system crushed. Now they're moving on and moving on. They're just going to keep us off our feet.
It looks like they're taking up the big controversial issues and moving quickly right away. And, people might be wondering, well, why are we talking about fracking again when we just talked about that last session? And you might remember what happened last session was that there was a bill passed under very controversial circumstances. It was originally passed by the General Assembly to begin to move towards fracking by creating a commission that would come up with regulations for fracking. And so that was actually, it was passed and then it was vetoed by former Governor Bev Perdue. And then that veto was overridden under very controversial circumstances.
A legislator made a mistake. And the Republicans didn't, a Democratic legislator voted for it when she meant to vote against it.
Becky Carney from Mecklenburg County.
Yeah, and they wouldn't let her reverse her vote.
They wouldn't let her reverse the vote, and so that's how we have
by one vote. That's how we have fracking now in North Carolina.
And so anyway, so there's this commission that's drawing up regulations, and so the process is already underway. But under that legislation, what was going to have to happen is once the commission drew up, a regulatory paradigm, this is how we're going to go about fracking in North Carolina, it was supposed to come back to the legislature, so there was to be another vote. But they decided that that was too slow, too cumbersome for the industry's interests. And so now they're considering legislation that's moving actually pretty quickly through the General Assembly right now that would essentially lift the moratorium. So starting in March of 2015, whether the regulations are ready or not, they would begin issuing permits.
And the industry says that they need this to get started on investment and everything. They need to know that it's not going to get held. But what that leaves the citizens with is, well, we don't know what these regulations are going to be, and we've already given permission for them to start drilling. So describe briefly what fracking is for people who, I know most of you know, but describe briefly what fracking is for people who don't know.
Fracking is a method of getting at what are called shale reserves of gas and oil that are, in underground rock formations. And so what they're doing is they're drilling down into these formations, and they're also doing horizontal drilling, which until last year was actually banned in North Carolina, where you drill down and then you start drilling over, and you pump in a mix of chemicals, sand, and enormous quantities of water to essentially break the rocks, release the gas, and then bring that up. And so that's.
And the chemicals, we're not allowed to know what these chemicals are in most states that allow fracking. Do you think North Carolina will actually say that the companies have to tell us what the chemicals are? Well,
that's one of the big questions. A lot of the chemicals that are used in the fracking process are considered proprietary.
Meaning that these are trade secrets?
Yes, trade secrets.
Oh, what nonsense.
Trade secrets.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you believe that? I mean, is that just their excuse to not tell us what they're doing to our drinking water, which is the accusation from environmentalists? This is going to hit groundwater.
That's the big concern, and so, one of the things that people need to think about is there's a couple different ways that groundwater can be contaminated from the fracking process, and you'll sometimes hear pro-industry folks say fracking has never contaminated groundwater, but they're usually defining it in a very, very narrow way, which means, just from the fracking process itself didn't actually get into a reserve and pollute it that way. What typically tends to happen, and what we've seen happen in other states, is the wastewater. You pump all this stuff down in there, and it
break
comes
up the
back
rock,
to the surface.
and then you bring it back.
It comes back to the surface. It's coming with all those chemicals that you put in there, plus there's naturally occurring radioactive materials in these underground formations. So all this is gushing back up, and it becomes a waste disposal problem. And that's where they've seen the real serious groundwater contamination.
Where they put
problems.
the waste.
Where does
where
the waste
where do they
go?
put the wastewater?
Well,
with all these chemicals and junk from the broken up rock and everything.
This is actually exempt from regulation, as some industries are regulated differently, and this is not regulated in a very strict manner at all.
At the federal level, you're saying?
It's not treated as hazardous waste, and so you can actually inject it into deep injections. And what you'll see at a lot of these fracking sites is it's stored in these large ponds on site. So in a state like North Carolina, where there's hurricanes, there's concerns that there's a lot of routes for this to get into surface waters and groundwaters.
So the concern is not just what the fracking water and the chemicals going in, but what do you do with those chemicals once you pull them out?
Exactly.
And just leaving them in pools on the site, on the fracking site, and we're not even allowed to know what the chemicals are,
yes,
is probably what the result is going to be. And so what do you think should happen? We're talking with Sue Sturgis, by the way, who's the editorial director of the Institute for Southern Studies. Mm-hmm. And she's been doing environmental reporting for years. It's top quality work, really. It's quite good. What do you think should go into a North Carolina fracking bill? It's going to happen, let's assume that.
Well,
right?
Maybe it will, maybe it won't. We'll see if
enough of us throw our bodies on the streets or light ourselves on fire in front of the legislature.
Or call their legislators.
Or call the legislators.
And maybe suggest that it shouldn't be rushed. The legislation that was passed last year had safeguards built into it, and now basically they're trying to remove those safeguards.
Can you talk about a couple of the safeguards that they're removing? I saw that was in the NNO, I think today, or maybe it was yesterday. There was a state geologist on the Mining and Energy Commission that was formed, and they just decided to boot him off.
Yeah, they want to change the composition of the commission. So this was the commission that was set up under last year's legislation, and they're the people drawing up the regulation. And from the very beginning, there's been concerns that that whole commission is stacked towards industry interests. So that's a long-standing concern, but they want to further stack it towards industry interests. And this latest legislation that's being considered right now would, as you said, remove the state geologist. It would also remove people who have experience with air resource management, water resource management, and waste management.
So anybody with any slight environmental bent is going to be booted off,
or scientific.
removed scientific bent.
Yeah, that's the thing. So you had said in the introduction that we're facing an issue of, are we going to be using science to make these really important policy decisions? And here we see it come up in the fracking bill, where they want to remove the scientific expertise from the commission. So that's a very critical safeguard that's going to be.
How would you respond to the industry people who'd say, well, we have scientists at our company. That's how we do this stuff, is with science.
Well, there's one of the other issues that we're facing in a lot of these different energy issues we're looking at the legislature is whether the decisions are going to be made in the interest of the industry or in the interest of the public. And the fact is, if you're a scientist who's being paid by an oil company or a gas company, whose interests are you going to have in mind? Isn't it important to have the state geologist? That's somebody who's, the work he does is in the public interest.
Arguably, that being paid to actually, not think of it just from the profit perspective.
Exactly, but from an objective perspective about how do we protect the people's health, how do we protect the environment.
And what's interesting is, all across the country you see accusations that the regulatory agencies are always in bed with the industries that they cover. And that's certainly been true with the Energy Information Administration, which has been lowering its estimates of what the fracking reserves are available are. But still the accusations are there that they're in bed with the industry. And so if you're even just getting rid of a geologist for the state, that seems needless. It seems unnecessary.
It seems a little crazy. Why would you want to remove that expertise, the state geologist?
No voting there. What else are they doing? They're one of the things that they're getting rid of this land registry.
Yeah, landmen's registry.
Landmen's. What is that?
The landmen are the people who go out and basically negotiate contracts with the landowners, and so.
So these are the farmers and the ordinary citizens, people who've had land that they want to drill down and then possibly horizontally underneath.
Yeah.
And so what?
And so the registry was basically to keep charlatans out of that business, and so they want to do away with that registry as well.
Why? The registry would make it easy to kind of contact people and see if there were any problems, see if this was being done on the up and up, see if there was some corruption, see if people were being promised things that were not true, and give them some little help in terms of legal recourse as these small landowners against these big multinational corporations.
Yeah. Well,
so why would you get rid of that?
My understanding is the industry, a lot of the changes that are being made in this legislation is because the industry feels some of the requirements are too cumbersome.
What about groundwater testing? Is that going to be part of this bill? Just to, set up a couple of monitoring stations around the big things. Is that something that should be part of this bill?
That's one of the things that's being discussed right now in the Mining and Energy Commission, which is drawing up the regulation. So they'll be deciding, how exactly we're going to go about ensuring fracking, if it is done in North Carolina, is done safely. And, advocates, people in other states who've dealt with the fracking issue, one of the things they often say is really critically important is you need to have some sort of baseline data. If you're going to understand if your groundwater's been contaminated by fracking, you first need to know what kind of condition it was in before.
So we should have the water.
Fracking.
So the groundwater monitoring should go in now.
Should go in now. Exactly.
Before we start fracking.
Before we start fracking.
Is the industry opposed to that?
I'm not sure. I can't speak for the industry on that. I know that's one of the things they're discussing right now in the commission, and
that would be good science.
And it would
good science is let's get the groundwater now, and then let's get the groundwater after fracking. That makes sense. Then we can compare the two and see if there's an issue.
Yeah, that's how you hold someone responsible for polluting.
Which is why it's not going to happen. No, I'm being too cynical. We're talking with Sue Sturgis from the Institute for Southern Studies. She's the editorial director over there. If you go to the blog at the Institute, it's southernstudies.org. The blog is called Facing South.
Yes.
Covers the entire South.
Yes.
And you focus on environmental issues in your work.
I focus on environmental issues.
And if you have questions for Sue, you can give us a call. The number's right down there, 996-6775. Carol has a question coming out of the control room.
Are we going to set up monitoring for earthquake activity prior to?
Carol's question, in case you couldn't hear that, are we going to set up monitoring for earthquake activity? Because that has been in Ohio. We saw lots of little earthquakes right after they started fracking.
In Arkansas as well.
And Arkansas as well. And how does the industry, first, is that something worth pushing for? And Second, what does the industry think about that?
My understanding is that's also being discussed in the commission. I did hear them, I've listened in on some of the meetings that they've held, and they have talked about monitoring for seismic activity. Now, of course, the thing, we're operating in an atmosphere where we don't know what the final regulations are going to look like, because right now they're just drawing them up. They're in the discussions, they're gathering information from other states, trying to figure out how to proceed, so we don't know exactly what these regulations will look like, which is why people are so freaked out that they want to lift the moratorium without knowing exactly what the regulatory structure will look like.
Yeah, and the industry's chomping at the bit, I'm sure. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about this boom town thing, because one of the states that gets looked at and quoted or talked about by some of the Republicans who are really vehemently in favor of this thing is North Dakota, where there's been, they say, oh, this huge boom, and McDonald's, this was, is now paying $15 an hour because they've got to compete with people who want to work at in the fracking business. And it's been, usually the boom towns usually go bust at some point pretty quickly, actually, before you expect it. That's the whole idea of a boom town, is the bust comes. So how sustainable is this? Are these reserves that we're seeing, are these estimates of reserves accurate? The industry is saying that the U.S. Geological Survey always underestimates the reserves, but I'm seeing the government agencies at the federal level, the Energy Information Administration. There was a series of articles in the New York Times a couple years ago where they just reduced by 40% their estimates nationwide of what's out there, because as we start drilling, we start finding less and less of the cheaply extractable stuff.
Yes.
So is that how accurate are these reserve estimates at this point in North Carolina? What does North Carolina have?
We're not completely sure exactly what North Carolina has, and there will be some uncertainty until drilling starts.
We don't know.
But one of the things we are seeing that's worth people keeping an eye on is we have legislators now who are inflating what the geologists say by tenfold.
10 times what the geologists are saying.
That's what they're saying, and they're just basing that not on any kind of testing of the reserves in North Carolina, but just saying that they believe that in other states it's been underestimated, and so they're just going to assume it's underestimated in North Carolina, but we really don't know exactly how much we have.
But there have already been places like in Texas and other places out west where the boom has already turned into a bust, and landowners who've been promised all this money are not seeing anything because the wells kind of they diminished very quickly. Haven't we seen that already?
Yeah, definitely. That's happened in places.
How do we know that's not going to happen here?
And the other thing people should keep in mind when they hear about the promises of jobs is what we often see, in other states where they do frack, is that the jobs are filled by people with expertise who are coming from other states. I'm from Pennsylvania, and there's a huge fracking industry there, and there was a great influx of people from other states, from places like Texas, where there's a large drilling industry already, who were going to Pennsylvania. It wasn't necessarily the local people who were getting those jobs. Now, of course, there is economic benefit to a community when that money comes in.
When new people move in.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that all the jobs that are going to be created will be filled by people who live in the communities where the fracking happens.
We're talking with Sue Sturgis from the Institute for Southern Studies. If you have a question for her, 996-6775. Fracking is just one of the issues we're seeing as we look at what role science is going to play in this new Republican-dominated state that we've got here. The other thing is this renewable energy law that passed in the last session, right? Or
2007.
2007. And it's been. And what can you describe? Because McCrory and Art Pope want to repeal this. I think that's what it looks like.
Well, I'm not sure if McCrory does, and I don't know where Art Pope stands on this, but there's definitely Republicans in the legislature who want this repealed. So what happened is back in 2007, the legislature overwhelmingly, Democrats and Republicans, passed a law. It was called Senate Bill 3. And it created what's called a REPS, a Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Portfolio Standard, shortened to REPS. And what that does is it requires the big investor-owned utilities in North Carolina,
Duke, Progress at the time,
exactly, and Dominion, and to generate a certain portion of their energy from renewable sources or from energy efficiency. And so currently we're at 3%, and so that means 3% of their power has to either be from efficiency, which means a savings, or from things like wind and solar.
So conservation is part of this too.
Conservation is part of it.
Encouraging people to waste less energy.
Exactly.
But why would Duke do that? Because that means we spend less money on Duke if we waste less energy,
it's one
right?
of the built-in contradictions of the whole thing.
But the point is it's only 3%.
So right now, and it's going to go up to 12.5% by 2025. But North Carolina was the first state in the Southeast to pass this. You know, it's pretty innovative. Other states have them around the country. I think it's 29 altogether at this point.
So the majority of states have these little renewable energy laws.
Exactly, and it's a way to, you know, to boost the industry, you know, and to also, you know, start to address the climate crisis, because, you know, that's sort of the large issue underlying all these different things that we're talking about is the climate crisis. You know, so the fracking issue is happening in the context of a climate crisis. Now we have this renewable energy law, and people are gunning for it. You know, and there's actually a national movement that involves conservative organizations that would like to see this repealed.
That's ALEC. This
ALEC
organization, this far right-wing organization funded by the Koch brothers and Art Pope and those guys.
Koch brothers.
Koch. I always get that mixed up, Carol. I always say Koch.
It's the American Legislative Exchange Council, and
they're pushing this agenda where they write the laws and shove it into a lot of legislatures.
That's what they do. It's
the country.
You know, it's an organization that's funded primarily by corporate interests. They get, you know, the overwhelming majority of their funding from corporations, and they draw up these model bills that then go to state legislatures, and, you know, it's basically a way to pass industry-friendly legislation. And there's a lot of controversy now. Common Cause actually filed a complaint saying that they shouldn't be considered a nonprofit because they're really a lobbying group, because they lobby for corporate interests. But at any rate, they're pushing a model law called the Electricity Freedom Act that would repeal.
The Electricity Freedom Act that repeals the idea that, hey, Duke Power, about 3% and going up to what did you say? 12.5 at some point. Maybe you should start looking at the future of humanity, right? You know, maybe some renewables and conservation.
And conservation.
And that is, ALEC is just ideological impurity, must destroy, right?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, so they want to do away with it. And so there's not been legislation introduced in this session yet. But Representative Mike Hager, who is from Rutherford County, he's the head of the House Utilities Committee, he said that this is going to be a priority for him, so we're waiting to see the legislation.
But Duke was in favor of this at the time.
And
you know,
Mike
maybe
Hager,
they wanted to look like they're doing something green, but they were in favor of it.
They remain in favor of it. They've made several statements saying that they favor it. And, you know, one of the issues when I talked to a spokesperson for Duke about this a couple years ago, actually I guess with somebody from Progress Energy, now a Duke subsidiary. What they said is, you know, a utility company has to plan years in advance, you know, so they don't like this uncertainty. They want to know, you know, by 2025, 12.5% has to be from renewable sources, and they're already planning for 2025 today, you know, so they have said that they don't like this uncertainty.
Well, they can still do it even without the law.
They could do
technically, Carol, right? Duke could decide, you know what, you guys repeal the law, we still think it's a good idea, we're going to do it anyway.
Yeah, but at any rate.
Well, dream on, yeah. But so they would prefer to see something stable.
Yes,
so
that's what they have said, you know, so we'll see.
Do you really think in their heart of hearts they wouldn't like to see the law repealed so they don't have to bother with that and they can just keep raking in short-term profits, you know, on non-renewable energy and not have to worry about conservation so much?
Well, you know, promoting conservation, the way the system is structured doesn't really help their shareholders very much.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's one of the strange contradictions of being in this sort of energy market, a regulated energy market.
That's why we need all energy to be public utility, you know, so that without the profit motive.
Well, it's almost like the worst of both worlds in North Carolina, where there's no free market, but, you know, the regulated market doesn't always work in the public interest.
So offshore drilling is another thing that's coming.
Yeah.
And you just posted something at the Facing South blog today, which, by the way, if you go to I keep wanting to say facingsouth.org, but it's southernstudies.org.
Yes.
The blog is called Facing South. Sue has a post today about the Pat McCrory's new push for offshore drilling. What can you describe what you think is particularly unusual about Pat McCrory's push for offshore oil drilling on North Carolina?
Well, what was surprising is the statement he made in his State of the State address on Monday. He talked about, he wanted to begin offshore drilling in North Carolina, and he's talked about this before. He's very much a proponent of this, and he's now working with Governor Nikki Haley in South Carolina and Governor Bob McDonnell in Virginia to get together and create, a compact.
So they want to create this like Eastern Coast, basically offshore drilling boom in the southeastern United States.
That's what they would like to do. And so they've communicated with the Obama administration and said, we would like your help with this. Well, in the course of discussing this in his State of the State address, one of the things McCrory said he would like to do with any potential revenues from offshore oil drilling would be to use it for beach replenishment projects. And so I wrote a piece today about that because it struck me as a strange disconnect in his thinking, because offshore, I've spent a lot of time in Louisiana doing reporting on the energy industry there. And one of the things that, no matter who you talk to is going to, raise as a big concern is the fact that Louisiana is sinking into the Gulf of Mexico.
It's losing beach, it's losing coastline.
Faster than anywhere else in the country.
And you think that's related to the offshore oil drilling that's going on?
Well,
there?
Scientists tell us it is. I mean, this is not anything that's up for debate. We know it is, and we know that.
Why? Can you give us quickly a couple of examples of how that works? How does offshore drilling actually lead to reduced coastline?
One of the things I think misconceptions that people have about offshore drilling is it's something that happens way out there and it doesn't have any impact on the coast itself, and that's not true. If you go to Louisiana and you go to coastal areas where drilling is happening off the coast, what you'll see in the coastal marshlands are massive amounts, and I actually have a picture of this on the blog today so you can get a sense of what it looks like. If you've ever flown into New Orleans, you'll see this from the air, these strange straight cuts through the coastal marshlands. And those are canals that have been dredged by the energy companies both for navigation and for running pipelines for infrastructure. And so offshore oil drilling has a big impact on the coast itself. There's a lot of associated infrastructure, and that industrialization of the coast damages the marshlands. It allows the salt water to intrude, and then the salt water damages the trees, which are kind of holding the soil in place.
And the trees, the roots of the trees hold the coastline in place.
And so it kills it. The salt water comes in, kills the trees die, and suddenly, the soil is allowed to go into the Gulf. And so this is why it's losing so much of its coastal land.
Does the same thing happen with beach property? Do they tend to avoid the tourist beaches so you don't see it as much?
Well, the problem that happens when you have coastal erosion, and it was something that was discussed a lot after Hurricane Katrina, is you can't really think of pieces of the coast in isolation. The whole system works together as an integrated ecosystem. And so if
I hate that Mother Nature does that. She doesn't let you just change one thing over here, Carol.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And so the problem that you have is as you start losing, these wetlands in some places, as the storms come in, they're going to come in fiercer and harder and further inland, and they're going to erode the sandy beaches. So it becomes this very complicated process that basically is going to lead to sped up erosion. There's already an erosion problem in North Carolina. The beaches are disappearing. Right. The storms are becoming more intensified, in part because of global warming, and they're just wiping out the beaches. And we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year.
The evidence that we're losing beach in North Carolina is clear, whether or not you buy into global warming, which if you don't, you're ignoring a lot more evidence. But the evidence is clear. We have a problem.
Yeah.
We have to replenish the beaches here.
Well, some people would argue that we don't
that we
have
shouldn't.
to replenish.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. But we're losing beach. We're losing beach. Yeah, we're losing beach.
We need to address it one way or the other. And there's a lot of experts in coastal geology who have real serious problems with the replenishment. They sort of feel like we should let these natural systems behave naturally. But if we're going to take a natural route, that would rule out cutting these, canals through the wetlands. We shouldn't do that if we really want to.
And isn't it also true that when you pull out if here's the land and you're pulling out all this oil, don't you get some subsidence
Yes.
in the land as well? So you get a lowering of the land as you pull out all this. You're lowering the pressure underneath, basically.
You're sucking out the bubble.
You're
and,
sucking,
you know,
and the land actually
subsides.
lowers a little bit. So that's another way that this.
That's another way.
And so here's Pat McCrory saying offshore drilling is going to help us replenish the beaches.
Yeah, and it's
when the scientific evidence is clear that it doesn't.
No, it won't. You know, I mean, we could take that money and use it to replenish the beaches, but you're never going to be able to drill your way out of the problem because it's just going to keep getting worse as you drill and do more exploration and more industrialization of the coast.
I hadn't thought about the infrastructure pipelines. You have to have many of them, I imagine, or at least a bunch of them going in.
Get on Google
the
Earth.
more
and
you
look at Louisiana.
look at Louisiana,
Look at
you'll see these cuts.
You will see them
into the coast.
They're obviously unnatural. They're completely straight, and they're running, you know, perpendicular to the Gulf, and so they're, you know, basically these channels just pulling salt water into the marsh.
Killing the trees and then reducing the land. Wow. Yeah. Well, there you go. We're talking with Sue Sturgis from the Institute for Southern Studies. Well, you've had your first half hour. We're actually going to continue. So now is your time to call 995. What is it? 996-6775? 996-6775. Let's talk a little bit more about the. I want to go back to talk about fracking for just a second. Okay. Obama's a fracker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and an offshore driller.
And an offshore driller, yeah.
This is not just a Republican thing. I'd like to make clear. You know, this is a bipartisan problem of, you know, pushing these environmentally destructive approaches to our energy future.
There's this kind of investment boom happening with fracking now, and the New York Times did a series a couple of years ago called "Drilling Down." I think it was 2011 in the summer, where they had a lot of investment bankers saying this is just a quick little bubble that, you know, these estimates are being wildly inflated.
They compared it to .com boom.
To the .com boom, yeah, you know, and I mean, how can we? Basically, what's happening is all these people are rushing in trying to make money quickly.
Yeah.
And the landowners see a lot of easy money. Mm-hmm. And you've got these, you know, legislators, maybe their hearts are in the right place. They see a poor, you know, poor farmers, you know, scattered around rural North Carolina who have a chance to cash in. Mm-hmm. How can we protect these farmers? Is this something that's really going to help them? Or, I mean, you know, what can we do to protect the people who are selling, you know, leasing their land to the gas companies?
Well, I mean, one thing.
Have we seen problems with this in the past, or?
Well, one of the problems that we've seen in North Carolina is that landowners don't necessarily own their mineral rights, and, you know, that's been a problem that, you know, I haven't done a lot of reporting on it, but there's been some great reporting on that by other news outlets, where, you know, suddenly people realize they don't own the mineral rights.
So they can just come in and go down and then horizontally under your property.
Yeah.
Horizontally under your property.
And if you're in a rural area, you're probably on a well. And so, you know, then you have concerns about, well, is my well going to end up contaminated? You know, and they
don't have to pay you anything.
You don't get paid, and you have no say in it. So you're rendered powerless, essentially.
What do you think about the industry's denials that groundwater has ever been found to be contaminated by this? I mean, how's the science on that?
Well,
is the science still inconclusive?
No. The U.S. Geological Survey has confirmed what the EPA originally said, which is
in Pennsylvania?
Wyoming is one of the places where it's happened. Yeah, and, you know, fracking has contaminated groundwater. You know, and so that's scientists telling us this. This is not industry scientists. This is scientists working in the public interest telling us that this has happened. So I think, you know, you have to take it seriously, and that's why it's really important that if you're going to have fracking, you have to ensure that the regulations are drawn up in a very deliberative way. And so what we see instead in North Carolina is now suddenly what was supposed to be a slow deliberative process is being rushed, you know, so it's creating a lot of pressure to just move ahead.
And tomorrow in the Senate, the North Carolina Senate, this will be Thursday if you're watching the rerun, but Wednesday is today. Tomorrow in the Senate there's a hearing?
I don't know if it's going to be a full hearing, but I believe the Senate Finance Committee is going to be looking at this latest fracking bill. So, you know, it's moving through the Senate, and assuming it passes there, it will move on to the House, where there's been actually Representative Tom Tillis, who's the head of the House, has made some statements saying that he thinks they may be moving too fast, so there may be hope to slow this down in the House.
Really? Tom Tillis thinks they may be moving too fast.
Because, you know, he was really one of the architects of the legislation that passed last year.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that had safeguards built into it, and now they want to do away with those, so he has expressed some concerns about that.
What would you like to see happen? So you're Sue Sturgis, you're the editorial director of the Institute for Southern Studies. You study environmental issues, you report, you investigate. Ideally, if a fracking bill was going to happen in North Carolina, can you think of a couple of things that you would definitely like to see in this fracking bill?
Well, I guess first of all, I should say in an ideal world, we would be moving completely towards renewables. I mean, I think, you know, like I said, the climate crisis is the backdrop of all of this. And given that, it's just madness to keep investing further and further in fossil fuels. You know, and there's been a lot of rhetoric about how gas is somehow less carbon intensive than, you know, oil or coal. But you know, it's not it's not carbon unintensive enough to make a difference, and so it would be great to see companies investing in the future rather than in fossil fuels.
When you're talking about solar and wind,
about renewables and
Okay.
primarily efficiency.
Yeah.
You know, if you're going to look for the low-hanging fruit, the first thing you do is stop waste, and the fringe benefit of that is you save money at the same time.
Except Duke doesn't make as much money.
So
when you stop the waste, we as a country all benefit. Our children and grandchildren, well, yours, I'm gay, but you know, our children, well, I could, you know, future generations of the species we all share benefits, right? Yeah. And you know, that would be great, but in the short term, Duke loses a little bit of profit if people don't waste as much energy.
Yeah.
That's all right, but you're still avoiding the question, Sue Sturgis of the Institute for Southern Studies.
So if we are going to go,
if we are going to have a fracking bill,
well, that's not my ideal world.
It's not your ideal world. In this best of least possible worlds or something, what would you think should be definitely in a North Carolina fracking bill?
Well, at the most basic level, you have to have disclosure of what chemicals are in the fracking fluid. I mean, that's the most, you know, most fundamental thing is people should have a right to know what is actually being pumped into the earth under their property. You know, and so if there is any kind of problem,
or under the property next to them, because Mother Nature, like you said, you know, it's all one thing, seamless whole. The universe is one.
Your aquifer doesn't stop at the edge of your property.
At the property line, yeah, yes. The aquifer extends.
And let me once again reiterate that, you know, these areas that are being targeted for fracking in North Carolina are primarily rural areas where people are very reliant on wells. They don't have the privilege that we have here in Raleigh of, you know, having Falls Lake. We have a municipal water source. These people, you know, are pulling water up off of their own property, and so it's a real concern.
And so chemicals, we have to know the chemicals. What else should be in the bill?
Well, I think one of the most important things is, you know, in terms of the commission that's drawing up the regulation should be acting in the public interest. I think that's one of the most fundamental and important things that should happen to
and not just rubber stamping the profit, cashing in.
You don't take scientists
out.
If you want, you know, I'm not an expert in terms of how our regulation is going to work best because, frankly, when I look at other states where they have fracking, there's been problems in all of them. So I just don't know how you do it and protect people in every instance. I just don't think it's possible. There's going to be instances of contamination, whether it's, you know, spills on land, spills into surface waters like rivers
this idea
or
of the
creeks.
waste fluid after they pull it out with all this junk in it, just sitting in pools, waiting for the next huge hurricane to flood the North Carolina, it's just horrifying.
Yeah.
That's
and dams
horrifying.
fail. I think the last time I was on your show, we talked about coal ash, and we were talking about the disaster in Tennessee where a dam failed and a community got
And all this
inundated.
coal ash just poured down, this waste, this coal waste.
From coal-fired power plants, And so, you know, our landscape is dotted with all these potential disasters, and fracking is just going to add one more level, really.
Sue Sturgis from the Institute for Southern Studies. The blog is called Facing South at southernstudies.org. Carol, how much time do we have?
We have about 7 minutes.
Okay, good. Can I talk a little bit about the protections for landowners here? Can we talk a little bit about the legal protections that other states have done? I mean, is there anything that you can do to protect people from being ripped off by these slick lawyers who come in, and wave money in front of them. I mean, because there have been families in Arkansas and other places that have been completely left high and dry with cleanup costs and just, no responsibility from the companies at all. Is there any kind of legal protection we should write into the bill for landowners?
Well, I haven't seen a state where that hasn't been a problem, so I'm not quite sure how you'd structure it. I mean, there's not a place I can point to that says, this is the place that's got it right,
It's all very new, isn't it?
It's relatively new, and when it comes into a place, it seems to come in fast, and it takes people by surprise. I met some farmers in Pennsylvania who were very eager to allow fracking on their land. It was a way to make money, and they were left with an incredible mess. I mean,
How so? What was the mess they were left with?
Well,
these farmers in Pennsylvania.
One of the problems is that fracking takes these rural landscapes and turns them into industrial landscapes. So that's one of the things.
Roads coming in.
Heavy equipment, trucks at all hours. One of the things they've seen in towns in Pennsylvania where fracking comes is that they have, huge spikes in accidents. There's all these trucks on the road, roads are getting torn up, so it creates costs for local communities. And then they had problems with spills on their property, concerns about the health of the livestock. There's been problems in Louisiana, for instance. There's a lot of fracking happening there. And there's been livestock that have been killed under mysterious circumstances next to fracking operations, And so there's
thinking it's the chemicals?
Exactly.
They think it's the chemicals, which we're not allowed to know about.
Yeah, you might not know what it is. And then also, there's been human health impacts. I met with a mayor from a small town in Texas where there's a real fracking boom, and his own children developed respiratory problems, because these things are not operating without emissions. There's associated emissions with them. They're not only a groundwater contamination concern, they're an air contamination concern.
There's a lot of air contamination as well.
And so, if you're pumping chemicals into the ground and it's, rushing back up, some of that's going to be vaporized and you're breathing it in.
It's hard to prove that kind of thing, though, isn't it? How do you know is the respiratory illnesses were caused by that?
Exactly, yeah.
It's really hard.
It's really hard, so you might not get compensation or help with your medical bills.
And the earthquake thing is real, or is that just overblown?
The earthquake thing is real.
Really?
Yeah.
Pumping all this water at high pressure into shale causes the earth to tremor? What a shock. Where is it real? Where have we seen this?
Arkansas is one of the places where they've had problems with earthquakes.
The industry denies it, though, don't they? Doesn't the industry still insist on denying that there's any clear link to fracking with these earthquakes, these mini earthquakes?
Regardless of what the industry says, I think the scientists have said that there seems to be a connection. So yeah, that's definitely another concern. And I know one of the concerns that I've heard raised at public meetings here in North Carolina is the fact that the Sheeran-Harris nuclear power plant is in the fracking zone. And so we saw with the earthquake in Virginia a few years ago, there's a lot of concern about the impact on nuclear plants. And so, how are we going to be impacting these other industrial operations in the fracking zone? That's one of the questions.
The feds aren't any help here, are they? The feds are not really, other industries are regulated at the federal level, other energy industries, aren't they? Isn't there aren't there certain rules about how you dispose of nuclear waste at the federal level?
For nuclear power, yeah, there are definitely federal rules. We've seen with coal ash, for instance,
they don't have federal rules for that.
They don't have federal rules for that, no.
So we're not getting any federal help in terms of setting guidelines from the EPA or Obama or whoever about how to deal with fracking wastewater. After you've injected it into the ground, what do we do with this chemical-laden mess?
There's something called the Halliburton loophole that exempts that from regulation at
from
a federal
fracking?
level. Yeah.
Exempts fracking fluids from that.
So
wow.
Oil and gas drilling waste is exempted from regulations that apply to other kinds of waste.
Always cheerful to talk with Sue Sturgis from the Institute for Southern Studies.
Sorry.
No. Thank you for joining us. You're watching Monkey Time. We're here live every Wednesday at 8. The show reruns Thursdays at midnight and Friday at 11. I always get Friday at 11 right, but I miss Thursday at midnight. That would be Thursday night, Friday morning, right?
Correct.
Okay. Can we talk about renewables for just a second to close up here? Because you said that in your ideal world, fracking wouldn't be necessary. 1 minute. Okay. So what would you'd like to see? Is there anything that we can do in North Carolina to pressure our legislators to do something to boost renewables aside from the one renewable energy law that we have?
Well, I think if you're interested in doing something, the first thing to do would be to keep your eye on any effort to repeal the renewable energy law. And if that's something you would like to see not repealed, weigh in with your lawmakers. Make sure that you contact your senators, your representatives, and let them know that you actually support this. Because that's the only hope for it to not go away.
For pushing it forward. Sue Sturgis, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Todd.
southernstudies.org. You can also go to my Twitter page, and I will consistently link to Sue's articles because she's fabulous. And ncleg.net is how to get in touch with you type in your zip code, it tells you who your legislators are. ncleg.net. Let them know that you want this renewable energy law that would pressure Duke to keep keep pushing for more conservation and more renewables in their mix. And it's a small percentage.
It is.
Let them know that you don't want to see that repealed. What do we got, Carol? All right. Thanks. We'll see you next week.